For this lesson, I'm going to talk about drum kits. I would imagine by now, if you've stuck to this point, some of you might be thinking, I should buy myself a drum kit. Totally up to you, you can wait a while, but let's go with it for now. I think the most important thing with a drum kit is you need to decide whether you're going to buy an acoustic kit or an electric kit. Both are as popular as each other. Acoustic drum kits are the traditional drum kit that people use, and certainly if you were learning in a school context, university context, college, something like that, or even at an instructor's house, you will a lot of the time use an acoustic drum kit. Purists will tell you it's the better sound, and I probably agree with that. You certainly can be more expressive with an acoustic drum kit, but they're loud. And the other problem with the acoustic drums is that while you can make the drums sound good generally by adding good skins to a cheap drum kit, to get a really good sounding drum kit costs a lot of money. But as I said, you can make the drums, most of the drums, especially the toms, the bass drum, etc., sound good. Snare drum, and I'll tell you what drum is which in a couple of minutes, but the snare drum, which is one of the main drums, unfortunately you get what you pay for, and it's pretty hard to make a cheap snare drum sound good. Cymbals are where you really notice whether you've spent money or not on a drum kit. So cymbals can be the good sounding ones like you hear in recordings and at gigs and that are expensive. Cheap cymbals, they'll do the trick, good for learning, but if you're taking them gigging or recording, they do tend to sound rubbish. I recommend to people, if you're buying your first drum kit, depending on your budget, and if you're buying an acoustic kit, buy cheaper drums, put good skins on them, and buy some good cymbals. The difference between a £2,000 drum kit and a £500 drum kit with a set of good skins on is not massive. You'll notice the 2000 is better, but not proportionately so. But you'll get a much better build quality. If you take a £500 drum kit and try taking it around gigs and you're packing it up and packing it down, etc., it won't last long. The fixtures, fittings of the drum kit, the things that hold everything in place, will start to break pretty quickly. And that's predominantly, a lot of the time, what you're buying. You're buying good shells that have a good sound that is marginally better than a cheaper drum kit, because most of the sound comes from the head. So if you put good heads on cheap drums, they can sound really good with good tuning. But the price of an expensive drum kit is in the build quality. And it means you can take it around to lots of gigs and it doesn't fall apart and you're not constantly trying to fix it. Cymbals, very different. Cheap cymbals are generally cast bronze, so they are iron, or the bronze, sorry, is put into like an iron or a bronze sort of cast, and they press them out in the shape, and you get it as it comes. And some of them might sound great, others won't. They're relying on a computer to make them uniform, and they're not. Because metal doesn't work that way. Mid-range to expensive cymbals, generally they might start off as a cast, but then someone will hand hammer them into space and get the ring and the tone to sound good. They'll use generally a more expensive bronze or a bronze alloy to get different colours, different effects, different sounds. And that, combined with the hand hammering, generally means they sound a lot better. Snare drums, because they have the snare on the bottom, and we'll go through what this all means in a tick, they are generally more expensive the better you get, and you get again what you pay for. You can buy a mid-range sort of, or something higher than entry-level drum kit and get a decent snare, it's okay. But these, I've seen snare drums cost £1,000, £1,500 on their own, and they're really, really good snare drums. There's a point, I think, where you can stop spending. It just becomes more a prestige thing then. But yeah, you get what you pay for on the snare drum because of the mechanical parts at the bottom of the drum. and the bearing edge that makes those parts vibrate, that has to be all set very precisely to get a good sound out of it. Okay. Electric drums are a different story. Again, the build quality will be a huge variance between cheap drum kits and expensive drum kits. But cheap, because it's electronic sound, cheap electric drum kits will sound almost as good as their expensive counterparts. You might get more libraries, more realistic sounds out of an expensive drum kit, but I'll be honest, the cheap one, and you're going to hear it in these lessons, sound pretty much as good as a top-end acoustic drum kit. And in that respects, they're very, very good. They're also very good in the fact that you can plug headphones in them or put an amp and turn it down low, and you're not spilling out a lot of noise then to your neighbours, and they'll thank you for buying an electronic drum kit over an acoustic drum kit. I use electric drum kits all the time. I love them because you can control the volume and I can hit as hard as I want, and the volume is controlled by amplification. They are not as dynamic and not as expressive as an acoustic drum kit. So you'll notice something might have 5 or 6 layers of sound, from really quiet to really loud, where if you had an acoustic drum kit you could probably get 30 layers of sound, from really quiet up to really, really loud. So they're not as dynamic in their range, but for most styles of music and for most of what people are playing, they're good enough. So if you're in a space like, I mean, in the UK, a lot of the houses are joined together. Mine isn't, but I know certainly my earlier houses when I was younger and didn't have as much money as I've got today, you know, were joined to neighbours. They'll probably thank you for having an electronic drum kit over an acoustic drum kit. But if money isn't a problem, sound pollution isn't a problem, etc., I would always recommend an acoustic over an electric, even though I'm going to use an electric in these lessons myself. I'm now going to talk, and the graphic's going to come up on the screen, but we'll talk about the drum kit and what you see. So the first drum we're going to look at is the bass drum. That is the thing that predominantly keeps the beat. It's the bassy sound, the thud, 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 thud that you hear in a lot of music, etc. It is one of 2 drums that are used to actually create the predominant drum beat that you hear in most music. Okay, so bass drum, very important. They come in various sizes from 20-inch up to about 26. 20-inch is called a jazz bass drum or a bebop. Actually, you can even get smaller ones, 16, 18-inch. They're very punchy, not very loud compared to their larger counterparts. Very punchy sound, very dead sound. Generally a bass drum will have something like a pillow or something in it to soften the sound and to stop the ringing overtones. You don't want a ringing tone. It's the only drum that you kind of tend to deaden. Most modern drum kits will have a 22 or a 24-inch bass drum on them, okay, because that's the more common size in modern music. But you can get smaller ones which are more punchy. I've seen some 26-inch bass drums. They're kind of a novelty really, they're just huge. Next drum I'm pointing to is a snare drum. It's called a snare drum because it has metal wires on the bottom that are on a sort of mechanism that you click and it will push those wires into the bottom drum head, and that is called a snare. A bit like a hunting snare that you catch rabbits in is, I think, where it came from. And that snare is what gives that drum that sound, and that is the other predominant drum. So normally, if we were talking a 4-beat drum phrase, you'll have your bass drum on beat 1, and on beat 3 you'll have something called the backbeat, which is the snare. So boom, da, boom, da, boom, da. Bass drum is normally done with your foot, using a pedal. You will normally hit with your left hand the snare drum, okay? And if you did nothing else, they are the 2 main drums you need to make a sound with, to make a drum beat. And in fact, you know, you can get songs like Queen, We Will Rock You. That is pretty much the 2 drums you hear. There's nothing else until later on in the song. Next drums are the toms, and toms are not as essential as the bass drum and the snare. In fact, in a lot of modern music, you'll see some drum kits with no toms at all. Some you'll see a couple of toms, some you'll see generally 3 toms, because that is the more traditional number. If you look at 80s heavy metal and rock, sometimes they'll have whole rows of toms going all the way around them. But they come in 2 variants. The most common ones are called mounted toms, which sit normally either on a bracket or a clamp that sits on top of the bass drum and attaches to that. Or they might sit in that same position but come off clamps or mounts off the cymbal stands. Mounted toms, sometimes called floating toms as well, they are there because they float, or they're mounted, and they will normally be in front of you beyond your snare drum, normally, as I said, hanging off the bass drum. That's the most common place for them. Then normally on your right hand side you will have something called floor toms, which are normally bigger toms. They're normally 16, 18 inch sort of size drums, as opposed to mounted toms that will normally be 10, 12, 13, 14 inch. And floor toms will be much longer in size and in shape, and they're quite a deep sound. They're not a million miles away from your bass drum, but because they're not muffled like the bass drum is, they ring out a bit more. Lots of songs. One I'm thinking of is sort of Wipeout, which is sort of, I think it was a 60s or 70s sort of surfer film, or song, sorry, used in films and other things. It has a big solo sort of thing just on the floor tom, but it's used in a lot of songs for that sort of piece. And it is, yeah, it's the deepest of the toms. And normally, if you're doing a phrase of tom drum fills to end a segment in the song, normally it'll start off at your mounted toms and work its way around to the floor toms. So that is the drums and how they work. You've got your bass drum and your snare, which are the 2 most important ones and pretty much the basis of all drum kits. You've got your mounted toms, which you can have 1 or 2 or many more, depending on your personal choice and budget. Traditionally you would have 2 mounted toms, although 1 mounted tom seems to be quite favourable in a lot of drum setups these days as well. And then you'll have a floor tom, and normally you'll have 1, although a lot of kits these days again are having 2 of them, depending on budget and how big a kit you want. But essentially floor tom, so normally you'd have a 22 or a 24 inch bass drum, you'll have a 14 inch snare drum, probably a 10 and a 12, or maybe a 12 and a 13 inch mounted tom, and a 16 inch floor tom, or maybe 16 and an 18 inch floor tom, depending on the size of your kit. Cymbals. 2 most important cymbals are your hi-hats, which are what opens and closes, and is generally on your left hand side. It's 2 cymbals, one inverted over the other, that open and close. They are the main time-keeping device of your cymbals, okay, and will form the minor part of just about every drum beat. Sorry. So your bass and snare will be what you use to make a beat. The hi-hat is what will be in the background, keeping the time along that beat. And you'll see what I mean when we get to the drum kit work. To give variance to a sound, etc., you can get something called a ride cymbal, which is where you move what you're doing on the hi-hat over to a cymbal as part of keeping a drum beat. And ride cymbals generally are 20 inch, but they can be 22, I've seen that. I think I've seen 18 inch ones, but that's quite, it's not very common. But 20 inch is the most common one. And that and the hi-hat are what you need to keep the drum beat. It is the bit that fills in the spaces between the bass and the snare. You also then have crash cymbals, and normally every drum kit would have a hi-hat, a ride cymbal and a crash cymbal. They're the 3 basic things you need to make a drum beat, okay? And crash cymbal, you hit it, it makes a sound, and it does everything you need it to do. It's loud, it's crashy, and you generally hit it the once at the end of a passage. So normally you'll have your drum beat going, you know, hi-hat, bass, snare. You'll play a phrase at the end of that beat before you go into, say, the chorus, whatever, across your toms, and you'll normally hit a crash cymbal to end that phrase, and then you'll start your drum beat off. You might go to the chorus, do the same beat again, but using the ride cymbal instead of the hi-hat. But they are the cymbals. Now there are millions of different types of cymbals they've made now and have done for a long time. You've got Chinas, you've got lots of different sizes of crashes. Crash, most common size is 16, but 18 is almost very close secondary popular size. You can get bigger and smaller crashes. You can get splash cymbals, which are like little 10-12 inch cymbals. You get Kratali bells, Chinas, just crash rides, lots and lots of different sounds, sizzle cymbals with rivets in it. Just, you know, if you look at a lot of drummers, they have lots and lots of cymbals, more so than drums, because there's a lot of sound that can be expressed from cymbals. But yeah, for the beginner you need a hi-hat, a ride cymbal, and one crash if that's all you can afford. I recommend 2 crash cymbals if you can afford it. Okay, but I'd rather you bought one crash and bought a better set of cymbals than limiting yourself to a cheaper range of cymbals to get 2 crash cymbals, because it's not 100% needed. It does make it easier to have one either side of you when you're playing, because sometimes you'll have a long reach to get to wherever your crash cymbal is from where you're playing. If you have one either side, you go to the nearest one, and that's why it's decent. Anything beyond that is superfluous and really is there for expression or possibly even just for showing off. You will buy more cymbals, I guarantee you. As you go on in your drumming career, you'll want to get things like Chinas and splash cymbals and stuff like that, because they can give you some really great effects. Some of the EFX cymbals with holes in them and that look fantastic as well when you're out gigging. But what you need, both on an electronic kit and an acoustic kit, is a hi-hat, ride cymbal, at least one crash, preferably 2. Okay, in those positions. So, last part about a drum kit, bass drum pedal. So your feet go on a set of pedals. You have your right foot will generally go on a bass drum, and that's what you hit that bass drum with, a bass drum pedal. You can get something called a double pedal, which is something I use on all my drum kits. And that just means you can use your left foot, you can take it off where it normally sits and do more complex drum beats. Used a lot in heavy metal and rock music, but there are other contexts where you can use that sort of pedal as well. But you don't need a double pedal day one. In fact, it'll be years before you need double pedal. Just buy a single pedal. Again, you get what you pay for. The more you spend, the faster they'll be and the longer they'll last, because they're built better. Okay. Last bit is the hi-hat. Normally sits on a stand. Some electronic drum kits where they haven't got a proper set of hi-hat cymbals or an up and down floating cymbal, they might just be a pad, which is not great, but it might be all you can afford, which is fine. It does the trick. And you'll have a separate pedal on a cable that triggers like you're on a hi-hat stand. But generally you have a stand with a foot pedal at the bottom of it, and that makes the cymbals open and close, and you can splash them, but generally you will have them closed, and then you'll open them up and make them open and close quickly as part of a drum beat when you're over on your ride cymbal, for instance. So that foot mechanism, that hi-hat stand, is important to have that. And normally the 2 cymbals are inverted on a rod that's coming up from that stand. Okay, there are lots of other things you can add to drum kits, percussion instruments like tambourines and cowbells and wood blocks and all these sorts of things. They'll all come later in your career, if ever at all. But generally you need 4 or 5 drums, preferably for what we're playing 5 drums, bass drum, snare, 2 mounted toms, 1 floor tom. You'll need a set of hi-hats, you'll need a ride cymbal, 1 crash, preferably 2. So that's all the parts of the drum kit. That's also explained the difference between a cheap drum kit and an expensive drum kit, and an electronic drum kit and an acoustic drum kit. Okay? The rest is up to you what you want to buy. Okay? Hope you found that informative, and I'll see you next lesson.